Hi everyone. So today I'm going to be looking at the Oera Linda book, and this is a book I read a little while back, and it's a very interesting book. It's got some interesting history to it, and it's my opinion on this book. I'll just say up front that it is actually real documented history of peoples from this region and their settlement after the flood. So I'll just go to Wikipedia for a brief explanation on what it is. Certainly won't be going there for an accurate explanation, but it says the Oera Linda book is a manuscript written in a form of Old Frisian, purporting to cover historical, mythological and religious themes of remote antiquity from 2194 BCE to 803 current era. Among academics in Germanic philology, the document is considered to be a hoax or a forgery. When you look into this, it's actually never been found to be a hoax or a forgery. They can't actually prove that it is, and it has been dated to be an ancient manuscript. The manuscript first came to public awareness in 1860. In 1872, Jan Gerhardus Ottmar published a Dutch translation and defended it as genuine. Over the next few years, there was a heated public controversy, but by 1879, it was universally accepted that the text was a recent composition. Nevertheless, a public controversy was revived in the context of 1930s Nazi occultism, and the book is still occasionally brought up in esotericism and Atlantis literature. The manuscript's author is not known with certainty, hence it is unknown whether the intention was to produce a pseudo-pictographical hoax or simply an exercise in poetic fantasy. The book itself says that it's a manuscript from the 13th century. With the permission of the proprietor, see over de Linden of the Helder. The original Frisian text, as verified by Dr. J.O. Ottmar. So the work of which I here offer an English translation has excited among the Dutch and German literary societies a keen controversy in regard to its authenticity. A controversy not yet brought to a conclusion, some affirming that it contains internal evidence of truth, while others declare it to be forgery. But even that later do not insist on its being the work of a modern fabricator. They allow it to be 100 or perhaps 150 years old. If they admit that, I do not see why they refuse it a greater antiquity. And as to the improbability of the stories related in it, I refer the reader to the exhaustive inquiry in Dr. Ottmar's preface. Is it more difficult to believe that the early Frisians, being hardy and intrepid marine adventurers, sailed to the Mediterranean, and even proceeded farther than the Phoenicians sailed to England for tin, to the Baltic for amber, or that a clever woman became a lawgiver at Athens? Then a goddess sprang full-grown and armed from the cleft skull of Jupiter. There is nothing in the narratives of this book consistent with the probability, however they may vary from some of our preconceived ideas, but whether it is really what it pretends to be, a very ancient manuscript or a more modern fiction, it is not the less a most curious and interesting work, and as such I offer it to the British public. In order to give an idea of the manuscript, I have produced photographs of 2 of its pages, which are bound with this volume. I have also allowed Dr. Ottmar's plan of printing the original Frisian opposite to the translation so that any reader possessing a knowledge of the language may verify the correctness of the translation. So in addition to the preference which I have translated, Dr. Ottmar has written 2 pamphlets on the subject of the Oera Linda book. 1. Historical notes and explanations. Number 2. The Royal Academy and Het Oera Linda book, both of which would be valuable to anyone who wished to study the controversy respecting the authenticity of this work, but which I have not thought it necessary to translate for the present publication. So if the book is a romance, then I must admit that it has been written with a good object and by a clever man, because the sentiments expressed in it are of a highly moral tendency, and the facts related, so far as they can be controlled by regular history, are not untruthful, and where they deal with the events of which we have no historical records, they do not offend our ideas of possibility or even probability. So this is by the translator, W.M.R. Sandbach. So the story of how it came about. C. Over de Linden, Chief Superintendent of the Royal Dockyard at the Helder, possesses a very ancient manuscript which has been inherited and preserved in his family from time immemorial, without anyone knowing whence it came or what it contained, owing to both the language and the writing being unknown. All that was known was that a tradition contained in it had from generation to generation been recommended to careful preservation. It appeared that the tradition rests upon the contents of 2 letters with which the manuscript begins, from Heido Oera Linda, anno 1256, and from Lyco Oera Linda, anno 803. It came to C. Over de Linden by the directions of his grandfather, Den Herr Andreas Over de Linden, who lived at Enkhuizen and died there on the 15th of April 1820, aged 61. As the grandson was at the time barely 10 years old, the manuscript was taken care of for him by his aunt, Affe Meilhoff, born Over de Linden, living at Enkhuizen, who in August 1848 delivered it to the present possessor, Dr. E. Verwees. Can't pronounce these. Having heard of this, requested permission to examine the manuscript and immediately recognized it as a very ancient friar's. He obtained at the same time permission to make a copy of it for the benefit of Friesland Society, and was of opinion that it might be of a great importance, provided it was not superstitious and invented for some deceptive object which he feared. The manuscript being placed in my hands, I also felt very doubtful, though I could not understand what object anyone could have in inventing a false composition only to keep a secret. This doubt remained until I had examined carefully, executed facsimiles of 2 fragments, and afterwards of the whole manuscript, the first sight of which convinced me of the great age of the document. Immediately occurred to me Caesar's remark upon the writing of the Gauls and the Helvetians in his Bello Gallico, Gracius utunter litteris, though it appears in volume 48 that they were not entirely Greek letters. Caesar thus points out only a resemblance, and a very true one, as the writing, which does not altogether correspond with any known form of letters, resembles the most, on a curious view, the Greek writing, which is founded on monuments and that old manuscripts, and belong to the form which is called lapidary. Besides, I formed the opinion afterwards that the writer of the later part of the book had been contemporary of Caesar. So Caesar here, he's saying, recognize a resemblance to the writing of the Gauls and to the Greek letters. The form and the origin of the writing is so minutely and fully described in the first part of the book as it could not be in any other language. It is very complete and consists of 34 letters. The paper of large quarto size is made of cotton, not very thick, without watermarks or maker's mark, made upon a frame of wire web with not very broad perpendicular lines. An introductory letter gives the year 1256 as that in which this manuscript was written by Oera Linda on foreign paper. Consequently, it must have come from Spain, where the Arabs brought into the market paper manufactured from cotton. On this subject, W. Wattenbach writes in his Das Schriftwesen Mittelalter in 1871, the manufacture of paper from cotton must have been in use among the Chinese from very remote times and must have become known to the Arabs by the conquest of Samarkand about the year 704. In Damascus, this manufacture was an important branch of industry, for which reason it was called Carta Damascena. By the Arabians, this art brought to the Greeks. It is asserted that Greek manuscripts of the 10th century written upon cotton paper exist, and that in the 13th century it was much more used than parchment. To distinguish it from Egyptian paper, it was called Carta Bombicina, Gospina Cutuna. So in old writings, the ink is very black or brown, but while there has been more writing since the 13th century, the color of the ink is often grey or yellowish, and sometimes quite pale, showing that it contains iron. All this affords convincing proof that the manuscript before us belongs to the middle of the 13th century, written with clear black letters between fine lines carefully traced with lead. The color of the ink shows decidedly that it does not contain iron. By these evidences, the date given is 1256 is satisfactorily provided, and it is impossible to assign any later date. Therefore, all suspicion of modern deception vanishes. The language is very old friars, still older and purer than the friars Ruchboek of the old friars' laws, differing that both in form and spelling, so that it appears to be an entirely distinct dialect, and shows that the locality of the language must have been as it was spoken between the Vlai and the Scheldt. So the style is extremely simple, concise and unembarrassed, resembling that of ordinary conversation and free in the choice of the words. The spelling is also simple and easy, so that the reading of it does not involve the least difficulty, and yet with all the regularity so unrestricted that each of the separate writers who have worked at the book has his own peculiarities, arising from changes in pronunciation in a long course of years, which naturally must have happened, as the last part of the work is written 5 centuries after the first. As a specimen of antiquity in language and writing, I believe I may venture to say that this book is unique of its kind. So the writing suggests an observation which may be of great importance. The Greeks know and acknowledge that their writing was not their own invention. They attributed the introduction of it to Cadmus, a Phoenician. The names of the oldest letters from Alpha to Tau agreed so exactly with the names of the letters in the Hebrew alphabet, with which the Phoenician will have been nearly connected, that we cannot doubt that the Hebrew was the original of the Phoenician. But the form of their letters differs so entirely from that of the Phoenician and Hebrew writing that in that particular no connection can be thought of between them. Whence then have the Greeks delivered the form of their letters? From that book Thera Adela Falsta, the book of Adela's followers, we learn that in the time when Cadmus is said to have lived about 16 centuries before Christ, a brisk trade existed between the Frisians and the Phoenicians, whom they named Cadhema, or dwellers on the coast. I think that this is important. The dwellers on the coast, they were both seafaring people. This will come up later. It's important that we note that the Phoenicians and the Frisians were both seafaring people. The name Cadmus comes too near the word Cadhema for us not to believe that Cadmus simply meant Phoenician. Further on, we learn that About the same time, a priestess of the castle in the island of Walt Sharon, Minerva, also called Nyhalina, had settled in Attica at the head of a Frisian colony and had founded a castle at Athens. Also from the account written on the walls of Warburg that the Finns likewise had a writing of their own, a very troublesome and difficult one to read, and that therefore the Tyrians and the Greeks had learned the writing of Phrygia. By this representation, the whole thing explains itself, and it becomes clear whence comes the exterior resemblance between the Greek and the old Phrygia's writing, which Caesar also remarked among the Gauls, as likewise in what manner the Greeks acquired and retained the names of the Finn and the forms of the Phrygia's writing. Equally remarkable are the forms of their figures. We usually call our figures Arabian, although they have not the least resemblance to those used by the Arabs. The Arabians did not bring their ciphers from the East because the Semitic nations used the whole alphabet in writing numbers. The manner of expressing all numbers by 10 signs the Arabs learned in the West, though the form was in some measure corresponding with their writing and was written from left to right, after the Western fashion. Our ciphers seem here to have sprung from the friars' ciphers, which form had the same origin as the handwriting, and is derived from the lines of the Yule. The book, as it lies before us, consists of two parts, differing widely from each other, and of dates very far apart. The writer of the first book calls herself Adela, wife of Apol, chief man of the Linda country. This is continued by her son Adelbrost and her daughter Apollonia. The first book, running from page 1 to 88, is written by Adela. The following part from 88 to 94 is begun by Adelbrost and continued by Apollonia. The second book, running from page 94 to 114, is written by Apollonia. Much later, perhaps 250 years, a third book is written from page 114 to 134 by Frethoric. Then follows from page 134 to 143, written by his widow Wiljar. After that, from page 144 to 169 by their son Conored. And then from page 169 to 192 by their grandson Bedin, pages 193 and 194, with which the last part must have begun, are wanting, therefore the writing is unknown. He may probably have been a son of Bedin. To fix the date, we must start from the year 1256 of our era, when Hero over de Linda made the copy, in which he says it was 3,449 years after Atland was sunk. Thus, disappearance of the old land was known by the Greeks, for Plato mentions in his Timaeus 24 and disappearance of Atlantis, the position of which was only known as somewhere far beyond the Pillars of Hercules. From this writing, it appears that it was land stretching far out to the west of Jutland, of which Heligoland and the islands of North Friesland are the last barren remnants. This event, which occasioned a great dispersion of the Frisian race, became the commencement of a chronological reckoning corresponding with 2193 before Christ, and is known by geologists as the Cimbrian flood. On page 80 begins an account of the year 1602 after the disappearance of Atland, and thus in the year 591 before Christ, and on the page 82 is the account of an murder of Frana Eremorda of Texland 2 years later, that is in 589, when therefore Adela commences her writing with her own coming forward in an assembly of the people 30 years after the murder of Eremorda. That must have been in the year 559 before Christ. In the part written by her daughter Apollina, we find that 15 months after the assembly, Adela was killed by the Finns in an attack by surprise of Texland. This must accordingly have happened 557 years before Christ. Hence, it follows that the first book written by Adela was of the year 558 before Christ. The second book of Apollina we may assign to about the year 530 before Christ. The latter part contains the history of the known kings of Friesland, Frisio Adel, Ubo, and Esiga Askar, called Black Adel, of the third king, Ubo. Nothing is said of rather that part is lost, as the pages 169 to 188 are missing. Fretheric, the first writer who appears now, was a contemporary of the occurrence, which he relates, namely the arrival of Friso. He was a friend of Ludgert den Gertman, who, as Rear Admiral of the fleet of Wisharit, the Sea King, had come with Friso in the year 303 before Christ, 1890 years after the disappearance of Atlant. He has borrowed most of his information from the logbook of Ludgert. The last writer gives himself out most clearly as a contemporary of Black Adel or Askar about the middle of his reign, which Fomerius states to have been from 70 before Christ to 11 after birth of Christ, the same period as Julius Caesar and Augustus. He therefore wrote in the middle of the last century before Christ and knew of the conquest of Gaul by the Romans. It is thus evident that there elapsed fully 2 centuries before the two parts of the work. Of the Gauls we read on page 84 that they were called the missionaries of Sidon. On page 124 that the Gauls are Druids. The Gauls then were Druids, and the name Gali, used for the whole nation, was really only the name of an order of priesthood brought from the east, just as among the Romans the Gali were the priests of Sibyl. Well, apparently the Gali were also the she-he priests of Sibyl. So in Wikipedia, Gali for ancient ethnonymous Gauls, for other uses of the singular form Gallus, for individual name Gali, and for other uses see Gali. So was a Gallus, Gali was a unique priest of the Phrygian goddess Sibyl, Magna Mater in Rome, and her consort Attis, whose worship was incorporated into the state religious practice of ancient Rome. So they were eunuchs, they were he, she, priests, priestesses, whichever gender fluid assignment they wish to take, just like the Devas of India. Just on a side note, to the cult of Sibyl, it says it may have originated in Mesopotamia, arriving in Greece around 3000 BC. And an interesting reference in the book of Daniel is the beast of Greece, which was depicted by a leopard, and we have the cult of Sibyl coming out of Turkey with a mother goddess that sat on a leopard throne. Just for a little further information on the Gali, it says the Gali were priests in the cult of the goddess Sibyl. They may have been devoted specifically to her consort Attis, who had castrated himself in a fit of divine frenzy. On initiation to the cult of Gali, also castrated themselves and afterwards dressed exclusively in women's clothing. They therefore occupied an ambiguous space in Roman notions of gender that many modern transgender and non-binary people have identified with. Altars to Sibyl and figures of Attis have been found on Hadrian's Wall at both Chester's Roman fort and Corbridge, which means it is possible that the Gali worshipped in Britain. So going on with the Oera Linda book, the whole contents of the book are in all respects new. That is to say, there is nothing in it that we were acquainted with before. What we here read of Frizzo, Adal, and Asker differs entirely from what is related by our own chroniclers, or rather presents it in quite another light. For instance, they all relate that Frizzo came from India, and that thus Frisians were of Indian descent, and yet they add that Frizzo was a German and belonged to a Persian race which Herodotus called Germans. According to the statement of this book, Frizzo did come from India and with the fleet of Nearchus, but he is not therefore an Indian. He is of Frisian origin, of Friar's people. He belonged in fact to a Frisian colony which after the death of Helena 15.5 centuries before Christ, under the guidance of a priestess Gert, settled in the Punjab and took the name of Gertman. Gertman were known by only one of the Greek writers, Strabo, who mentioned them as differing totally and entirely from in manners, language, and religion. So, when we look at the Punjab, this is where the Sikh people come from. Northern India, the Northern Indians are very Aryan in their appearance. The histories of Alexander's expeditions do not speak of Frisians or Gertmen, though they mention Indo-Scythians, thereby describing a people who live in India, but whose origin is in the distant unknown north. I believe that this book may tie in with the whole concept of Atlantis being in the North Pole, and the sinking of Atlantis, or the antediluvian world, was an exodus of people from the north. And I'll go into that later, but I just want to add that here so that we remember exactly these particulars of the origins of the people who come against the Frisians, and also when we look into the ancient migrations of people relating to the book of Genesis. In the accounts of Ludegert, no names are given of places where the Frislanders lived in India. We only know that they first established themselves to the east of the Punjab and afterwards moved to the west of those rivers. It is mentioned, moreover, as a striking fact that in the summer the sun is midday was straight above their heads. They therefore lived within the tropics. We find in Ptolemy, see after map of Kuiper, exactly 24 degrees north on the west side of the Indus, the name Minagara, and about 6 degrees east of that in 22 degrees north, another Minagara. This name is pure friars, as the name Walhalla Folsgara, and comes from Mina, the name of an Ermorda, in whose time the voyages of Tianus and his nephew Inca took place. So we have some interesting names here, Inca, and also we can look into the origins of the Inca and of the people from New Zealand and Easter Island. There is a really good documentary of a red-headed, green-eyed New Zealand native who traces her origin back to Persia through DNA. The coincidence is too remarkable to be accidental and not to prove that Minagara was the headquarters of the Frisian colony. The establishment of the colonists in the Punjab in 1551 before Christ and their journey thither we find fully described in Adala's book, and with the mention of one most remarkable circumstance, namely that the Frisian mariners sailed through the strait which in those times still ran into the Red Sea. In Strabo's book, pages 38 to 50, it appears that Eratosthenes was acquainted with the existence of the strait, of which the later geographers make no mention. It existed still in the time of Moses in Exodus, for he encamped at Pi Ha Shirot, the mouth of the strait. Moreover, Strabo mentions that Sesostris made an attempt to cut through the isthmus, but that he was not able to accomplish it. that in very remote times the sea really did flow through is proved by the result of the geological investigations on the isthmus made by the Suez Canal Commission, of which M. Reynaud presented a report to the Academy of Science on the 19th of June 1856. With regards to this question, it is certainly of importance to fall in with an account in the Frisian manuscript, from which it seems that in the 16th century before Christ, the connection between the Bitter Lakes and the Red Sea still existed, and that the strait was still navigable. The manuscript further states that soon after the passage of the Gertman, there was an earthquake, that the land rose so high that all the water ran out, and all the shallows and alluvial lands rose up like a wall. This must have happened after the time of Moses. So at the date of the Exodus, 1564 BC, the track between the Suez and the Bitter Lakes was still navigable, but could be forded dry foot at low water. So here we have some sort of affirmation to the story of the Red Sea crossing. During this time in the Oera Linda book, there was a lot of upheaval and earth changes happening. This point then is the commencement of the isthmus, after the forming of which the northern inlet was certainly soon filled up as far as the Gulf of Pelusium. The map by Louis Viguier in the Année Scientifique et Industrielle, Paris, in 1857 gives a distinct illustration of the formation of this land. Another statement which occurs only in Strabo finds also here a confirmation. Strabo alone of all the Greek writers relates that Nearchus, after he had landed his troops in the Persian Gulf at the mouth of the Spasitigris, sailed out of the Persian Gulf by Alexander's command and steered around Arabia through the Arabian Gulf. As the account stands, it is not clear what Nearchus had to do there, and what the object of the further voyage was. If, as Strabo seemed to think, it was only for geographical discovery, he needs not have taken the whole fleet. 1 or 2 ships would have sufficed. We do not read that he returned. Where then did he remain with the fleet? The answer to this question is to be found in the Frisian version of the story. Alexander had brought the ships on the Indus, or had them built by the descendants of the Frisians who settled there, the Gertmen, and had taken into his service sailors from among them, and at the head of them was Friso. Alexander, having accomplished his voyage and the transport of his troops, had no further use for the ships in the Persian Gulf, but wished to employ them in the Mediterranean. He had taken the idea into his head, and it must be carried into effect. He wished to do what no one had done before him. For this purpose, Nearchus was to sail up the Red Sea, and on his arrival at Suez was to find 200 elephants, 1,000 camels, workmen and materials, timber and ropes, in order to haul the ships by land over isthmus. This work was carried on and accomplished with so much zeal and energy that after 3 months' labour the fleet was launched in the Mediterranean. That the fleet really came to the Mediterranean appears in Plutarch's Life of Alexander, but he makes Nearchus bring the fleet around Africa and sail through the Pillars of Hercules. After the defeat of Actium, Cleopatra, in imitation of this example, tried to take her fleet over the isthmus in order to escape to India, but was prevented by the inhabitants of Arabia. Petra, here we have Petra, the Nabatean Edomites, who burnt her ships. See Plutarch's Life of Antony. When Alexander shortly afterwards died, Friso remained in the service of Antonius and Demetrius until, having been grievously insulted by the latter, he resolved to seek out with his sailors their fatherland, Frisland. To India he could not indeed return. So what's interesting, I'll just stop here now, is the connection between the Phrygians, the connection between the Greeks And we have this Indian connection too. And in our past research into the Zoroastrian faith and Babylon, we see how all of these faiths and beliefs move out into the nations of the earth, specifically India. And I'll go into further showing what I believe into the writings of the Oera Linda. Thus, these accounts chime in with and clear up each other, and in that way afford a mutual confirmation of the events. Such simple narratives and surprising results led me to conclude that we had to do here with more than mere saga and legends. Since the last 20 years, attention has been directed to the remains of the dwellings on piles first observed in the Swiss lakes and afterwards in other parts of Europe. When they were found, endeavours were made to discover by the existing fragments of arms, tools, and household articles by whom and when these dwellings had been inhabited. There are no accounts of them in historical writers beyond that Herodotus writes in Book 5, Chapter 16 of the Paeonen. The only trace that has been found is in one of the panels of Trajan's pillars, in which the destruction of a pile village in Dacia is represented. Doubly important, therefore, is it to learn from writings of Apollonia that she is Bergmar, chief of the virgins, about 540 years before Christ, made a journey up the Rhine to Switzerland and there became acquainted with the lake dwellers, Marsaten. She describes their dwelling built upon piles, the people themselves, their manners and customs. She relates that they lived by fishing and hunting, and that they prepared the skins of animals with the bark of the birch tree in order to sell the furs to the Rhine boatmen, who brought them into commerce. This account of a pile of dwellings in the Swiss lakes can only have been written in the time when these dwellings still existed and were lived in. In the second part of the writing, Conrad Oera Linda relates that Adel, the son of Friso, 250 years before Christ, visited the pile dwellings in Switzerland with his wife Ifkia. Later than this account, there is no mention by any writer whatever of the pile dwellings, and the subject has remained for 20 centuries utterly unknown until 1853, when an extraordinary low state of the water led to the discovery of these dwellings. Therefore, no one could have invented this account in the intervening period. Although a great portion of the first part of the work, the Book of Adela, belongs to the mythological period before the Trojan War, there is a striking difference between it and the Greek myths. The myths have no dates, much less any chronology, nor internal coherence of successive events. The untrammeled fancy develops itself in every poem separately and independently. The mythological stories contradict each other on every point. Les myths ne se tiennent pas is the only key to the Greek mythology. Here, on the contrary, we meet with a regular succession of dates dating from a fixed period, the destruction of Atlan, 2193 before Christ. The accounts are natural and simple, often naive, never contradict each other, and are always consistent with each other in time and place. As for instance, the arrival and sojourn of Ulysses with the Bergmar Calip at Walhalagara, which is the most mythical portion of all, is here said to be 1005 years after the disappearance of Atlan, which coincides with the 1188 years before Christ, and thus agrees very nearly with the time at which the Greeks say the Trojan War took place. The story of Ulysses was not brought here for the first time by the Romans. Tacitus found it already in Lower Germany, and says that at Scaburgium there was an altar on which of Ulysses and his father Laertes were inscribed. Another remarkable difference consists in this, that the myths know no origin, do not name either writers or relators of their stories, and therefore never can bring forward any authority. Whereas in Adela's book, for every statement is given a notice where it was found or whence it was taken. For instance, this comes from Minno's writing. This is written on the walls of Warburg. This is the town of Freya. This is Stavia, Walhalagra. There is also this further: laws, regular legislative enactments, such as are found in great numbers in Adela's book, are utterly unknown in mythology, and indeed are irreconcilable with its existence. Even when the myth attributes to Minos the introduction of law-giving in Crete, it does not give any least account of what the legislation consisted in. Also, among the gods of mythology, there exists no system of laws. The only law was unchangeable destiny and the will of the supreme Zeus. With regard to mythology, this writing, which bears no mythical character, is not less remarkable than with regard to history. Notwithstanding the frequent and various relations with Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, we do not find any trace of acquaintance with the Northern or Scandinavian mythology. Only Woden appears in the person of Woden, a chief of the Frisians, who became the son-in-law of one of Magi, king of the Finns, and after his death was deified. The Frisian religion is extremely simple and pure monotheism. Rolda, or Rolda's spirit, is the only eternal, unchangeable, perfect, and almighty being. Rolda has created everything. Out of him proceeds everything. First the beginning, then time, and afterwards Eartha, the earth. Eartha bore 3 daughters, Lida, Finda, and Freya, the mother of the 3 distinct races, black, yellow, and white, Africa, Asia, and Europe. As such, Freya is the mother of Freya's people, the Frislanders. She is the representative of Rolda and is reverenced accordingly. Freya has established her texts, the first law, and has established the religion of the eternal light. Now this is interesting, the eternal light, and this will come up later too, relating to the Zoroastrian investigation. The worship consists in the maintenance of a perpetually burning lamp, Fodik, by priestess virgins. At the head of the virgins in every town was a Bergmad, and the chief of the Bergmaden was the Ermorder of Texland. The Ermorder governs the whole country. The king can do nothing, nor can anything happen without her advice and approval. The first Ermorder was appointed by Freya herself and was called Fasta. In fact, we find her the prototype of the Roman Vestal versions, also the Greek priestess system, the temples, and I will look into the Olympic system of the eternal flame. I believe that this text is a real documentation of the Freudian history of the people after the flood, and I think that contained in its text may be some insight into the system and beliefs of the antediluvian people. We are reminded here of Velda and Aurenia in Tacitus, Germania, and of Gauna, the successor of Valda, in Dio Cassius. Tacitus speaks of the town of Valida as Edita Turis. On page 146, it was the town Managada Forda. In the country of Marcians, he speaks of the temple Tanfane, so called from the sign of the Yule. So the last of these towns was Fastaberg in Umland. Temple Fost, destroyed according to Oca Scalensis in 806. If we find among the Frisians a belief in a godhead and ideas of religion entirely different from the mythology of other nations, we are the more surprised to find in some points the closest connection with the Greek and Roman mythology, and even with the origin of 2 deities of the highest rank, Minerva and Neptune. Minerva, Athena, was originally a Bergmut, priestess of Freya at the town of Walhallagara, Middleburg or Domburg in Walkeren. And this Minerva is the same time the mysterious enigmatical goddess of whose worship scarcely any trace remain beyond the votive stones at Domburg in Walkeren. Nehelena, of whom no mythology knows anything more than the name, which etymology has used for all sorts of fantastical derivations. And, if these people such as Minerva, Athena, were linked to the people of Athens and the Greeks from the Frisians, would it make sense that Nehelena is possibly linked to Helen of Troy, Helena, Hellenists? The other Neptune, called by the Etrurians Neptunus, the god of the Mediterranean Sea, appears here to have been, when living, a Friesland Viking or sea king whose home was Eldurga. His name was Tianus, called familiarly by his followers Neptunus, or cousin Tunis, who had chosen the Mediterranean as the destination of his expeditions and must have been deified by the Tyrians at the time when Phoenician navigations began to extend their voyages to so remarkably sailing to Friesland in order to obtain British tin, northern iron and amber from the Baltic about 2,000 years before Christ. So I just want to add in here that the Oera Linda book coincides with the Bible. It coincides with the studies into the migration of the people from the area of Asia Minor as they moved up around the Black Sea up into the European continent up north. And from what this is saying in the Oera Linda book, that the Frisians then moved south from their northern position into places like Greece and Britain. According to the book of Genesis, I think that the Frisian people may be the descendants of Japheth. And we look at the other descendants of Japheth. Some go east and some go west. The eastern side of the descendants, or the Gog-Magog tribes, are the ones that the Bible describes as the wicked ones that we have to watch out for. Besides these two are met with a third mythological person, Minos, a lawgiver of Crete, who likewise appears to have been a Friesland sea king, Minno, born at Lindord between Wirringen and Crail, who imparted to the Cretans an Azarga book. He is the Minos who, with his brother Rhadamanthus and Aeacus, presided as judges over the fates of the ghosts in Hades, and must not be confounded with the later Minos and contemporary Aeacus and Theseus who appear in the Athenian fables. The reader may perhaps be inclined to laugh at these statements and apply to me the words that I myself have lately used, fantastic and improbable. Indeed, at first I could not believe my own eyes, and yet further consideration I arrived at the discovery of extraordinary conformities which render the case much less improbable than the birth of Minerva from the head of Jupiter by a blow from an axe of Hephaestus, for instance. Now, again, I'm going to stop and add about Minerva. The name Minerva also rhymes with Nineveh, which was an Assyrian capital at the time. And I believe that this ties in with the Bible in Isaiah, the 3/3 of heaven. And I think that the 3/3 of heaven are referring to the three descendants of Noah that come out of the flood. This whole Oera Linda book is linked to the sinking of Atlantis, the flood, And in Genesis, we have the dispersion of people on the earth from the 3 sons of Noah. Now, in Isaiah, it's the 3/3 of heaven, or the people in favor with God. And the first third is the Assyrian, the second is the Egyptian, and the third is the Israelite, or the Shemite. And I think that, as has been proven, that the Egyptians were Hamites. The Assyrians haven't been proven to be Japhites. I think they've said there's somebody else. But I think personally, going on these ancient manuscripts, that it ties in with the Assyrian being a Japhite. And then we have the Shemites, who were related to Shem and the Israelites who came out of them. Nimrod, for example, of the Tower of Babel and Babylon, was a Hamite. In the Greek mythology, all the gods and goddesses have a youthful period. Pallas alone has no youth. She is not otherwise known than adult. Minerva appears in Attica as a high priestess from a foreign country, a country unknown to the Greeks. Pallas is a virgin goddess. Minerva is a Bergmaid. The fair blue-eyed Pallas, differing thus in type from the rest of the gods and goddesses, evidently belongs to friars, people. The character for wisdom and the emblematical attributes, especially the owl, are the same for both. Pallas gives her new town her own name, Athenae, which has no meaning in Greek. Minerva gives to the town built by her name Athene, which has an important meaning in friars, namely that they came there as friends, Athen. Minerva came to Attica about 1600 years before Christ, the period at which the Grecian mythology was beginning to be formed. Minerva landed with the fleet of John at the head of a colony in Attica. In later times, we find her on the Roman votive stones in Walcheren under the name Nehelena, worshipped as a goddess of navigation, and Pallas is worshipped by the Athenians as the protecting goddess of shipbuilding and navigation. So this shipbuilding ties in here with the descendants of Japheth, the sea people. And also we see in discovering the descendants of the people of Troy, who moved to what is today known as Rome and founded the Roman civilization. Time is the carrier who must eternally turn the wheel, or the Yule, the wheel of the year. All religions are based on the wheel of the year, and carry the sun along its course through the firmament from winter to winter, thus forming the year. Every turn of the wheel begin a day. In midwinter, the Yule Feast is celebrated on Friar's Day. Then cakes are baked in the form of the sun's wheel, because with the Yule, Freya formed the letters when she wrote her texts. The Yule Fest is therefore also in honor of Freya as inventor of writing. And just to give away where I'm going with this direction, in the Bible we have the Israelites baking cakes to the Queen of Heaven. And we can see here that this cakes on the Yule Fest is showing the meaning of what this is and the paganism that sprung up from the mother goddess worship. So the Oera Linda is based on a priestess mother goddess system. Whether originally it was a goddess or just a system of a female matriarchy, but I believe that this has come out of the flood. They have brought a good knowledge and intention of righteousness. The people were not unrighteous, and they brought laws that were good for their community from the people of Noah, who was, according to the Bible, perfect in his generations. So therefore they were a people who were restored from the antediluvian world who were perfect in their generation and their faith, I believe. However, it is evident that this mother goddess linked to Freya comes from the Babylonian or the Sumerian myths of Inanna. Cakes are baked in the form of sun wheels because with Yule, Freya formed the letters when she wrote her text. The Yule Fest is therefore also in honor of Freya as an inventor of writing. Just as the Yule Fest has been changed by Christianity into Christmas, I beg to differ on that word. I really despise them using Christianity as the inventor of doctrines that are simply not in the Bible or have been spoken of by Christ himself. And we should insert the word Roman Catholicism. And when we look into the history of Roman Catholicism, it ties in with the history of Islam, and it comes from these Edomite convert people. And it's pretty evident, even the Apostle John states that in his Revelation, that there will be false Christs coming. Throughout Denmark and Germany and into St. Nicholas Day in Holland, so certainly our St. Nicholas dolls, the lover and his sweetheart, are a memorial of Freya, and the St. Nicholas letters a memorial of Freya's invention of letters formed from the wheel. So yeah, I'll just finish off by saying that anyone who tries to denounce Christ and call him a Jew religion or through Jews is misinformed on history and misinformed of who the Jews are today. Jews are not Israelites. So you cannot say that the Abrahamic faiths are Jew faiths because they are literally not Jews of the tribe of Judah, nor are they Israelites of the descendants of Jacob. However, they are deceivers and they are mask wearers. This is evident from the history, from when the Russians destroyed the Khazars. They stole people's identities, they robbed and murdered people on the trading routes. They were liars, they were cheats, they were deceivers. And in the history, we see that the Edomite converts were doing the same in the temple. This is what Jesus was angry at. The false religions that were coming into Judea, into the southern kingdom. We see in Daniel that the southern kingdom was only established so that the Messiah would be born. Then, in the time of Jesus, the last third of heaven, Israel was finally cast to the earth with the other 2/3. So you cannot argue and say that Christ is a Jew invention and then go and read their Talmud and see that they've written that Christ is boiling in a vat of excrement in hell, or bragging that Christ was the son of a Roman soldier and his mother was a prostitute. Why would they invent something and then hate it so much? I mean, it's contradictory to their character. They hate Jesus. The only invention they have made of Jesus is the false Christ that they have placed as head of the Roman Catholic religion and all of the churches that come out of her. And that's pretty much every single church that calls itself Christian today. The Jews we know today are predominantly Edomite and Khazarian converts. I'll analyze the whole contents of this writing and must content myself with the remarks that I have made. They will give an idea of the richness and importance of the contents. If some of it is fabulous, even as fabulous it may have an interest for us, since so little of the traditions of our forefathers remain in us. An internal evidence of the antiquity of these writings may be found in the fact that the name Batavians had not yet been used. The inhabitant of the whole country as far as Scheldt are Freya's people, Frieslanders. The Batvians are not a separate people. Name Batvi is a Roman origin. The Romans gave it to the inhabitants of the banks of the Wal, which river bears the name Patabus in the Tabula Pentingriana. The name Batvi does not appear earlier than Tacitus and Pliny, and is interpolated in Caesar's Bello Gallico. I will conclude with one more remark regarding the language. Those who have been able to take only a superficial view of the manuscript have been struck by the polish of the language and its conformity with the present Friesland language and Dutch. In this, they seem to find grounds for doubting the antiquity of the manuscript. But I ask, is then the language of Homer much less polished than that of Plato or Demosthenes? And does not the great portion of Homer's vocabulary exist in the Greek of our day? It is true that language alters with time and is continually subject to slight variations, owing to which language is found to be different at different epochs. This change in the language in the manuscript accordingly gives ground for important observations to philologists. It is not only that of the 8 writers who have successively worked at the book, each is recognizable by slight peculiarities in style, language, and spelling, but more particularly between the 2 parts of the book, between which an interval of more than 2 centuries occurs, a striking difference of the language is visible, which shows that a slow progressive regulation it has undergone in a period of time. As the result of these considerations, I arrive at the conclusion that I cannot find any reason to doubt the authenticity of these writings. They cannot be forgeries. In the first place, the copy of 1256 cannot be. Who could at that time have forged anything of the kind? Certainly no one, still less anyone at an earlier date. At a later date, a forgery is equally impossible for the simple reason that no one was acquainted with the language except Grimm, Richthofen, and Hatema. No one can be named sufficiently versed in that branch of philology, or who had studied the language so as to be able to write it. And if anyone could have done so, there would have been no more extensive vocabulary at this service than that which the East Frisian laws afford. Therefore, in the centuries later elapsed, the preparation of this writing was quite impossible. Whoever doubts this, let them begin by showing where, when, and whom, and with what object of a forgery could be committed, and let him show in modern times the fellow of this paper, this writing, and this language. Moreover, the manuscript of 1256 is not original, but is a copy, is provided by the numerous faults in writing, as well as some explanations of words which already in the time of the copyist had become obsolete and little known. A still stronger proof is that between pages 157 and 158, 1 or more pages are missing, which cannot have been lost out of this manuscript, because the pages 157 and 158 are on the front and back of the same leaf. Pages 157 finishes thus: 3 months afterward, Edel sent messages to all the friends that he had gained and requested them to send him intelligent people in the month of May. When we turn over the leaf, the other side begins, his wife said, who had been maid of Texland had got a copy of it. There is no connection between these two. There is wanting at least the arrival of the invited and an account of what passed at their meeting. It is clear, therefore, that the copyist must have turned over 2 pages of the original instead of 1. There certainly exists then an earlier manuscript, and that was doubtless written by Lyco Oera Linda in the year 803. We may thus accept that we possess in manuscript in which the first part was composed in the 6th century before our era, the oldest production after Homer and Hesiod of European literature. And here we find our fatherland, a very ancient people in possession of development, civilization, industry, navigation, commerce, literature, and even elevated ideas of religion, whose existence we had never even conjectured. Hitherto, We have believed that the historical records of our people reach no farther back than the arrival of Frizzo, the presumptive founder of the Frisians, whereas here we become aware that these records mount up to more than 2,000 years before Christ, surpassing the antiquity of Hellas and equaling that of Israel. So, going on this person's, the translator's account of this, I do believe this is a real book, and it may even be copied from much, much older manuscripts going on the history, which is quite ancient. They may have just copied the manuscripts from those times. That being said, it shows to me that it coincides with the ancient scripture of the Bible, and as he says here, that of Israel, and the history that relates to that. This is why they may want to say that this is a forgery, as this adds more evidence to the dispersion of people from the flood. And, you know, the people that rule today like to keep this information hidden, like to keep us in the dark and have us believing that we come from apes. So in the Oera Linda book, it starts with Adela. O king, my son, you must preserve these books with body and soul. They contain the history of all our people as well as our forefathers. Last year I saved them in the flood as well as you and your mother, but they got wet and therefore began to perish. In order to not lose them, I copied them on foreign paper. In case you inherit them, you must copy them likewise, and your children must do so too, so that they may never be lost. Written at Leeuwert in the 3449th year after Atlan, as Atlan was submerged. That is according to the Christian reckoning, the year 1256. Heido, named Oera Linda. Beloved successors, for the sake of our dear forefathers and of our dear liberty, I entreat you 1,000 times never to let the eye of a monk look on these writings. They are very insinuating, but they destroy in an underhand manner all that relates to us Frisians. In order to gain rich benefices, they conspire with foreign kings who know that we are their greatest enemy, because we dare to speak to their people of liberty, rights, and duties of princes. Therefore they seek to destroy all that we derive from our forefathers and all that is left of our old customs. Ah, my beloved ones, I have visited their courts. If Rhoda permits it, and we do not show ourselves strong to resist, they will altogether exterminate us. Lyco, surname Oera Linda. And apparently this is written in Anno Domini 803. So I believe this to be true. When we investigate into the time of the Crusades, which was not long after this period, we see that by that stage we'd had these Edomite Khazarian converts, the Pierre Leone family, who were in with the Pope, and the kings of the earth, the banking families, were already present at this time in history. So 30 years after the day on which the Volksmörder was murdered by the commander Maggie was a time of great distress. All the states that lie on the other side of the Weser had been wrested from us and had fallen under the power of Maggie, and it looked as if his power was become supreme over the whole land. To avert this misfortune, a general assembly of the people was summoned, which was attended by the men who stood in good repute with the Magden priestesses. Were they like the Gali, I wonder? Then at the end of 3 days, the whole council was in confusion and in the same position as when they came together. Thereupon Adela demanded to be heard and said, "You all know that I was 3 years Bergmard. You know also that I was chosen for Volksmörder, and that I refused to be Volksmörder because I wished to marry Uphold. But what you do not know is that I have watched everything that has happened as if I had really been your Volksmörder. I have constantly travelled about observing what was going on. By that means I have become acquainted with many things that others do not know. You said yesterday that our relatives on the other side of the Weser were dull and cowardly, but I may tell you that the Maggie has not won a single village from them by force of arms, but only by detestable deceit, and still more by the rapacity of their dukes and nobles. Freya has said, "We must not admit among us any but free people." But what have they done? They have imitated our enemies, and instead of killing their prisoners or letting them free, they have despised the counsel of Freya and have made slaves of them. Now, number one, this verse here ties in with biblical law. In the Bible, the Israelites were to not mix with their outside people, and they were to kill their enemies and not to let them live. So we have a tie here to Freya's people and the Israelite people. The law of Freya and the law of the Israelites. In Deuteronomy 7, verse 3 to 4, the law of the Israelites was, "Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughters shall take unto thy son. For they will turn away thy sons from following me. They may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you and destroy thee suddenly." So the Israelites were not to marry the outer nations, just as Freya's people were not to marry people from the other nations. They knew via this law that their nation would be destroyed by accepting other people into their family. The story of the Bible is not a story of righteous people. It's a story of families that come out of the flood, and through the Israelite people, the redemption would be born. That is, the Messiah would be born for all people. It's not saying that these people are righteous or that they weren't wicked. Messiah had to be born because at that time also is when people received the Holy Spirit. Messiah, Jesus, became the second Adam, and God breathed his spirit back into man as the resurrected man, the second Adam, the first fruits, and they were given the Holy Spirit. There's no other religion on earth that proclaims that people receive the Holy Spirit as life, because basically all other religions are pretty much based on the creation story and are all based around trying to redeem mankind back to their original state in Eden, or what's referred to as heaven. But none of them offer the Holy Spirit as a way, or God's Spirit, to quicken or make people alive. As we know, the wages of sin is death, and sin was first experienced by Adam and Eve by taking the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, which then required that they be redeemed to receive the Spirit from God. All other religions that are on earth stem from Babylon. This can be traced and tracked back to the core foundation of the faith. And all other religions teach a redemption through one's own effort. All of those religions teach that we can climb to heaven on a ladder system, opposed to the one that Jesus came to preach, was that God came down to earth to meet us, to save us on our level. And it says in Ezra 9, 1-2, "Now when these things were done, the princes came to me, saying, The people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the people of the land, doing according to their abominations, even of the Canaanites, the Hittites and the Perizzites, the Jebusites and the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians and the Amorites. For they have taken their daughters for themselves and of their sons, so that the holy seed have mingled themselves the people of those lands. Yea, the hand of the princes and rulers have been chief in this trespass." So, mingling yourself with the outside pagan nations destroyed society, destroyed the laws of society, destroyed the morality of society, because these people had gone astray from the true intention that God had for mankind. In Leviticus 26:7, the Bible tells the Israelites, "You will chase your enemies and they will fall by the sword before you." So have no mercy of them. It also talks about when they go into the land of Canaan to destroy all the Canaanite people. Now, a lot of people say this is the cruelty of God, but it's just the reality of you cannot change or accept these people into your nation if you want to be a strong nation or family and have a righteous civilization. Because they have thus acted, Pharaoh cared no longer to watch over them. They robbed others of their freedom and therefore lost their own. This is well known to you, but I will tell you how they came to sink so low. The Finn women had children. They grew up with our free children. They played and gamboled together in the fields and were also together by the hearth. There they learned with pleasure the loose ways of the Finns, because they were bad and new, and thus they became denationalized in spite of the efforts of their parents. When the children grew up, they saw that the children of the Finns handled no weapons and scarcely worked. They took a distaste for work and became proud. Sounds like today. The principal men and their cleverest sons made up with the wanton daughters of the Finns, and their own daughters, led astray by this bad example, allowed themselves to be beguiled by the handsome young Finns in derision of their depraved fathers. When the Magi found this out, he took the handsomest of his Finns and Magyars and promised them red cows with golden horns to let themselves be taken prisoner by our people in order to spread his doctrines. His people did even more. Children disappeared, were taken away to the uplands, and after they had been brought up in his pernicious doctrines, were sent back. Now, I've heard some people say regarding the Tartarian Empire that it was the Magyars who were the possible rulers of the Tartarian Empire. And the Magyars are known as the Hungarians, an ethnic group primarily associated with Hungary. The word Hungarian has also a wider meaning because, especially in the past, it refers to all the inhabitants of the Kingdom of Hungary. So Magyars were the main inhabitants of the Kingdom of Hungary that existed throughout most of the second millennium following its disappearance with the Treaty of Trianon. Magyars became minority inhabitants of Romania, Slovakia, Serbia, and the Ukraine. Hello, Ukraine. Significant groups of people with Magyar ancestry live in various other parts of the world, but unlike the Magyars living with the former Kingdom of Hungary, only a minority of these preserves the Hungarian language and tradition as a people of Turkic origin. So here we go, and if you go back and look at my research on the Turkic people, they were descendants of Japheth. And specifically, the Khazarian people were the tribes of Gog and Magog. Now, the Khazarian or Tartarian people are also the Magyars, the Magi. So the Oera Linda book is telling us here that the people of Freya were getting overrun by the Magyar, the Khazarians. And I believe later on in the Oera Linda it says that the Finns, who were the Magi, had mixed with Lida's people, who, according to the Oera Linda, the Asian nations. So the ethnic affiliations and origins of the Hungarian people. The origin of the Hungarians is partly disputed. The most widely accepted Finno-Ugric theory from the late 19th century is based primarily on linguistic and ethnographical arguments, while it is criticized by some as relying too much on linguistics. There are also other theories stating that the Magyars are descendants of Scythians, Huns, Turks, Avars, and or Sumerians. These are primarily based on medieval legends whose authority and scientific reliability is strongly questionable and non-systematic linguistic similarities. Most scholars therefore dismiss these claims as mere speculation. The following section shows the Finno-Ugric theory of origin of modern Hungarian people. For some other theories, see Hungarian prehistory. So in the Finno-Ugric is a group of related languages, which does not mean that the peoples currently speaking those languages are equally related in terms of ethnicity. The same holds true, for example, of Indo-European languages. Also, the Hungarian language is about as distantly related to Finnic languages as Finnish, and Estonian as e.g. Russian is related to Italian or Spanish. So east of the Ural Mountains. In the 4th millennium BC, some of the earliest settlements of Finno-Ugric speaking peoples were situated east of the Ural Mountains, where they hunted and fished. From there, Ugrians, i.e. the ancestors of the Magyars, were settled in the wood-steep parts of western Siberia. So here we go, they're the Khazarian, they're the Tartarian people, the Hungarians, and they come from Siberia. They were the tribes of Japheth that went east. And according to the Oera Linda, mixed with Finder's children. The Fryan people, I believe, are the tribes of Japheth that went west. And they settled in the sea coastal regions. In Genesis 9, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And God spoke unto Noah and his sons with him, saying, And behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your seed after you. Now God made a covenant with Noah's sons, all three of them. And in Isaiah 19 verse 23 it starts, In that day shall there be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria. Is that the king's highway, the starting of the Silk Road? And the Assyrian shall come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptian shall serve with the Assyrian. And in that day shall Israel be the third with Egypt and with Assyria, even a blessing in the midst of the land, whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed be Egypt my people, and Assyria the work of my hands, and Israel mine inheritance. Why was Israel God's inheritance? Because Jesus inherited the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven. Jesus was the resurrection, the second Adam. So in the 4th and 5th centuries, the Proto-Magyars moved to the west of the Ural Mountains, to the area between the southern Ural Mountain and the Volga River. In the early 8th century, a part of the Proto-Magyars moved to the Don River, a territory between the Volga and the Don and the Donets, a territory called Levidia. The descendants of those Proto-Magyars who stayed in Bashkiria were seen there as late as 1241. Indeed, many historical references related both the Magyars, Hungarians, and the Bashkirs as two branches of the same nation. However, modern Bashkirs are quite different from their original stock, largely reduced in number during the Mongol invasion 13th century and assimilated into the Turkic peoples. The Proto-Magyars around the Don River were subordinates of the Khazar Khaganate. Their neighbours were the archaeological Seltov culture, Bulgars. So anyone who wants to subscribe to Tartarian theology is subscribing to the Khazarians, who now rule our world, these evil, crazy converts to what they call the Semitic faith. They say they are Semitic, who are said to have built our empires, the European empires. So this is what Tartarian teachers are teaching you, that the Magyars are the people who established the Tartarian Empire. And if we look at the Oera Linda book, we can see that it's the Magi or the Magyars who are mixing in with the Finns, who are Finder's children, and who are moving in on Friar's children, who are trying to keep a righteous community. In Genesis 9 verse 18 to 19, and the sons of Noah that went forth of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Ham is the father of Canaan. These are the three sons of Noah, and of them was the whole earth overspread. In verse 25, God said, Cursed be Canaan, a servant shall he be unto his brethren. And he said, Blessed be the Lord God of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. God shall enlarge Japheth, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan shall be his servant. And Noah lived after the flood 350 years, All the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died